Good morning, Mary, and thank you very much for giving time to the Mint to talk about Veblen.
Well, thank you for having me.
I thought it'd be good to start first with just a sort of overview of Veblen's big ideas
Okay.
and in the sort of context that they happen.
Okay. Well, I think when you're talking about Thorstein Veblen, of course, institutional economists are going to claim him as an economist, but we are going to have to fight the sociologists over him because they also claim him as well. And so I think it's fairest to say that Thorstein Veblen was at his core a social scientist. So he believed that uh, when you're studying how human beings behave, that you have to look at the whole picture. You have to look at the political context in which they live. You have to look at the cultural environment. You have to look at the educational system. You have to look at their social relationships. So he was very much an interdisciplinary social scientist at its core. And I think you can see that in some of his main ideas. Probably his best known work is the theory of the leisure class. And in the theory of the leisure class, he takes apart the behaviors, especially of the wealthy elite, and looks at those behaviors within the social context. If anyone is familiar with the term conspicuous consumption, Thorstein Veblen coined that term in the theory of the leisure class, which he wrote at the beginning of the 20th century. And so when he was studying those consumption patterns, those patterns of behavior, he talked about the need to display wealth, the need to signal to other people and to social groups your particular social standing. And while mainstream economics of his time certainly wouldn't see that as rational sort of behavior, Veblen said, look, rational or not, you have to take into consideration what people are actually doing and analyze it on its merits. So you can't just, try to shave off the rough edges of a person and then try to fit them neatly into a category. So he talked about conspicuous consumption. He also talked about the need for emulation so that lower classes, less well-off classes will often consume products in an attempt to emulate the upper classes, and that this drives further consumption because as they are able to imitate the upper classes then need to try to distinguish themselves further and engage in a different kind of conspicuous consumption. Excuse me, Veblen called this invidious distinction. So you're trying to make yourself different and display your social class or signal your social standing to other people. And it's from this that he also came up with the idea of waste, so that not waste as we would typically think of it, but waste in the idea that it's a product or a good is just for show. It's not for any kind of useful purpose. It is just to flag, for instance, social standing. And individuals can engage in waste, but so can governments. So can organizations. And these are activities that don't actually produce anything, make anything. They are meant to send social signals of some kind. So that's one of his key ideas that I think has been incredibly influential, maybe not within the discipline of economics, but certainly in the way that we think about consumption. And especially, I think, as wealth disparity grows, it's something that seems to become more and more apparent. He was also he was an equal opportunity critic, but he believed that economics of his time, we're talking around the 20th turn of the 20th century, was far too narrow and static. And he has a very famous article that was published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, which is one of the most prestigious economics journals today. They would never publish what he wrote back in the end of the 19th century. But in this paper, he talks about the fact that economics is not an evolutionary science because it doesn't evolve. It doesn't take ideas, take in new ideas and discard old ones as knowledge accumulates, that it sticks to the same ideas. And he was particularly critical of neoclassical economics in that regard. And what's remarkable is that if you took, for instance, Alfred Marshall's Principles of Economics text, and if I showed it to my first year students, they would say, oh, this is everything we learned at A levels and everything we're currently learning. And I say, yeah, it
And
is.
that was, and Marshall was about 100 years ago.
Yes, yes, exactly, exactly. So clearly, economics is not on the bleeding edge of innovation. It uses some of the same core ideas, and it has done so since the early part of the 20th century. In microeconomics, we're going back further into the latter half of the 19th century. Those ideas have been around, kicking around for much longer. So yeah, those are probably the two things that he's known best for, his critique of consumption and his critique of mainstream economics.
So just going back, it's interesting the concept of waste. Did he think then all symbolic activities? So, I mean, for instance, obviously in medieval times, they put a huge amount of resources into building cathedrals.
Yes.
So would he have seen cathedrals as a waste?
Ah, that's a good question. He was certainly critical of what we might call ceremonial aspects. So, the pageantry around monarchy, the pageantry around certain religious practices. I don't know that it is fair to say that he would have been critical of the architecture itself. I think he would have been very critical of the accumulation of wealth within churches, and that's where his critique would be focused, because he was very much he still appreciated the arts. So I don't think he would have thought of the arts as something wasteful. I think he would have found the practices themselves as wasteful instead, if that
Yeah,
makes
because it's
sense.
sort of interesting because that comes down. Was he a sort of fundamentally utilitarian or
I
not?
would say no. I would say no. In fact, one of my favorite quotes from Veblen starts out. He's critiquing mainstream economics, and he states that the hedonistic conception of man as a lightning calculator of pleasures and pains. And so he is right in that sentence, taking aim at sort of the Benthamite utilitarian measure of pleasure versus pain. So I think he would say that that's an overly simplistic um, way of viewing the world and of assessing usefulness. But I think most of what his critique on ceremonial things, wasteful things, is in the face of wealth inequality. and
Right.
is in the face of people suffering. So, of course, if you have people who are suffering, then perhaps we should try to feed them, shelter them, rather than, giving them great works of art to see and not touch, to be distanced from, right?
But he probably would accept the idea that some sort of meaning in life, structure, sort of symbolic acts and things like that were important, would he? I mean, and that was the
I
sort
would, yeah, I would think so. Yeah, I would think so. He certainly did not advocate for us living in sterile gray boxes and only having useful products. But uh, like I said, his critique of waste in that the ability to waste resources, I guess, is a better way of thinking about it. Because if you can spend money on for instance, public works, but those public works aren't, uh, securing infrastructure. They're not making sure people have clean water, and they're not making sure that people have, a good education system. Then those public works, really, who are they for, right? So there has to be a practical end that must be met before we can talk about, non-practical
and clearly
expressions.
looking at all the super yachts hanging around the world, largely unused, would be,
Yes,
that would
yeah.
be the ultimate waste, wouldn't it? Uh,
Yes, 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 yeah, exactly,
so,
exactly.
did anyone listen to him?
Well, I'm sitting here talking to you, so apparently people listen to him. My teachers listen to him, and their teachers listen to him. Um, I think Veblen is probably better known in sociology, but he is still well remembered. And I have to say, uh, I was surprised to find out that mainstream economics actually does talk about Veblen. They talk about Veblenian goods
Ah,
with respect to upward sloping demand, so that people demand more as their prices go up. Um, so, it's small and it's not really it's something that Veblen would approve of, taking his ideas and putting them into a mainstream framework, but he's still there.
yeah.
So I think his work is more relevant today than it's ever been. The economics discipline certainly needs to heed his warnings, even though this article is written about economics is not an evolutionary science, was written at the end of the 19th century. Economics as a discipline still has not heeded that call. So I think they should listen to him now. Whether any of them do, that's another story.
But just going back, there was some suggestion that maybe he influenced people in the 30s in government during the New Deal and all that sort of area. Was that true at all?
Yeah, his students did. Veblen passed away in August of 1929, just a couple of months before the Great Crash, which is such a shame because I would love to have gotten his take on the Great Crash. Um, but his students were certainly very much involved in the construction of the New Deal. And in fact, during the interwar period in the United States, in academia, institutional economics was one of the dominant paradigms. Now, during that interwar period, when we were facing the Great Depression and Roosevelt is desperate to put together some kind of plan for the government, the institutionalists left the academy and they focused on policy. And it is during that time that while they were focused on policy, got pushed out of academic circles. And so that is the beginning of their marginalization within the economics discipline. So absolutely, his students were very much part of and people whose work influenced them were very much part of the construction of the New Deal. Yeah.
So what was, because I suppose my impression is the New Deal is now put in more of a Keynesian framework of spending in depression.
Mhm.
What were the elements of it which might be turned more institutionalist, or that might seem more inspired specifically by Veblen and his thinking?
Right. Well, yeah, and it's important to say that Keynes was not part of the construction of the New Deal. He didn't come over to the US. He wasn't an advisor in any form. The general theory came out in 1936, I believe. So pardon me. It was not as influential as looking back, we might say. Certainly, especially after all of the deficit spending of World War II, people said, huh, oh, maybe that Keynes guy was onto something.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he is frequently remembered as being incredibly influential in the New Deal. But Veblen's students had a particular focus on empirical analysis, data gathering. Um, they weren't torturing the data until it confesses, as we see in mainstream economics, but they were gathering information and they were making decisions based on the political institutions that were available. And when political institutions weren't available, they founded them. This is the advent of all of the alphabet agencies that we think of today when we think of the US government. They were created during this period as well. So we can see Veblen's influence, even if we can't draw direct lines from his theory to those aspects of the New Deal. They're there. They're there.
Can you give an example of a particular agency? Because I suppose for non-US people, people won't be aware of these agencies that were created, and that might be something that. How was it to start with that actually creating an agency or an institution was Veblen?
Well, um, now you're getting into areas outside of my expertise, but Veblen is, in retrospect, he did not call himself this, but he is an institutional economist. And institutional economists look at political institutions as one form of institution, the formal rules of the game, so to speak. And so he talks about the importance of formal institutions like that on our daily lives. And he also talked about informal institutions as well, which are customs and social traditions and things of that nature. Like I said, it's difficult to draw a straight line from, Veblen said this and we got this agency out of it. And I think Veblen would not want us to do that, even if we did. I mean, he would be very upset that we're even having this conversation about him right now, to be quite honest. Because he was very clear before he passed away, that he did not want any sort of remembrance of him. He didn't want any plaque. He didn't want a gravestone. He didn't want anything commemorating him. He saw himself as just a social scientist working within a context that in 100 years would be irrelevant. And so there would not be need to remember him or to make these connections. That he was working within his time was a product of his time and therefore would not be relevant later on. So he would not be happy with this.
That we've still got huge inequality and we've still got people wasting huge amount in sort of conspicuous consumption is still a big.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And if you read his work, Higher Learning in America, its relevance currently for both the US and the UK in higher ed, remarkable. I mean, he looks like a profit. And everything that he is talking about is everything, I've been based in the UK for over 10 years now. And everything that he has talked about, I am seeing on display in higher education in the UK as well. So the whole idea of marketization, the ideas of trying to run a university like a business. So his ideas are still kicking around because they still carry a lot of weight, and they still carry, well, not weight within, as in, valued by the economics discipline, for instance, but they still pack a powerful punch when it comes to analyzing these institutions that are still with us. So, yeah.
And you said that when the institutional economists left academia in the 30s to go into policy, they became marginalized. So was that the end? What happened to institutional economics after the 30s? Did it just disappear from
Well,
economics curriculum?
I mean, this is a complex story that has to be situated within the events of history. But what basically happened is they started to be marginalized during that period. And then once the US finally became involved in World War II, and we see the brain drain, especially from Europe, as famously physicists come to the US for safe harbor. What we also see in academia as part of the war effort is the direction of grants, endowments, funds, all into the hard sciences, physics in particular. Economics up to this point has not had the dominant mainstream course that we see today. But it's during the war that they see all of this money going to physics, for instance, and they start to use more and more abstract modeling, more and more quantitative analysis, so that they can imitate what is being done in physics, and so that they can get a piece of that grant money for themselves. And so that pattern sort of reasserts itself throughout the war and in the years after as well. And institutionalists keep getting pushed further and further to the margins. It never dies out. It never dies out. And you have graduate institutions in the United States. I attended one myself that focuses on economics as a social science, and institutionalism was part of my graduate training. So it never completely disappeared, but it has been effectively marginalized since the interwar period. Yeah, beginning in the interwar period.
There was the sort of new institutional economics, wasn't there? That
Yes, I have a professor who says that what is institutional is not new, and what is new is not institutional. And it is certainly true. And I studied the new institutionalists quite a bit when I was in graduate school because, as a baby economist trying to wrap my head around the original institutionalists versus the new institutionalists. And it seemed to me even then that new institutionalism is serving old wine in a new bottle. It's talking about the same things that even Veblen was talking about. So, for instance, Douglas North, one of the great new institutionalists, at one point in his work was talking about genetic programming. Well, this is the conversation that Veblen was having about instincts, back at the turn of the 20th century. So, how new is it? How new is it if it's just putting on a new, more technical sounding term onto something that people have already talked about? So, Yeah.
And I thought it was also, wasn't it, mathematized more and put in a sort of neoclassical maximizing utility sort of framework, was it not?
Right, yeah, it does depart from the mainstream in some ways, but new institutionalists definitely see themselves as um, adding something different to the mainstream, even though they are very much a part of the mainstream, as the fake Nobel in economics will attest. So.
Well, that's it. Recently, I suppose there have been some people who might call themselves institutionalists winning fake Nobel Prizes.
Yes, yes, it's true. It's true. And so they're, by and large, uh, using the same sort of abstract mathematical modeling, the same sort of rigorous econometric models, the same sort of methods that Veblen would have critiqued. Yes.
And there was, I mean, the classic, I'm trying to remember who won the Nobel Prize recently, but, trying to prove that the US institutional arrangements are the best possible in the best possible world. And that
Yeah,
other
we're
companies,
really, yeah, we're covered in glory now, aren't we?
yeah, I mean, yes, the strength of the institutions which will last forever. I mean, I suppose all those alphabet of organizations are being currently destroyed in the US.
Yes, yes. Alarmingly so. Yeah.
Well, I
It's
suppose the only thing we can say, I suppose, is that maybe people will begin to understand the importance of institutions.
yeah, I think so.
Once they've
Yes, I
gone,
think
I
so.
suppose.
Yeah,
Uh,
and as wealth inequality continues to grow, I think people are going to find a realignment of what they think of as waste, because we do hear a lot in the US news about waste and fraud. And that is what certain created government non-agencies are trying to address. But as it turns out, that is a very different kind of waste than what Veblen was talking about, because the waste that's currently being attacked is, of course, focused on, for instance, the attack on Medicaid, that is focused on helping people who are disabled, low income, who can't work, providing health care for them and benefits. And so that is not waste, according to Veblen, although it is according to our current political regime. So
well,
maybe people will realign that definition of waste.
well, let's hope that people will reread Veblen and reflect on that. Well, thank you very much, Mary. That has been really fascinating, and I think clearly, he was a great man, and it's really good to try and bring him back into the pantheon.
Yes, yes. And I have to say, if anyone out there is nervous about reading Veblen, let me just say he was incredibly sarcastic. So if you like sarcasm, this is your guy.
Well, that's a sales pitch if ever there was. Thank you very much indeed, and yeah, we hope things go better.
Yeah, yes, indeed.